Hello, everyone. Tensions between Venezuela and the United States have once again escalated so sharply that rumors are spreading on social media about the possibility of a war between the two nations. But how much truth is there to these claims? What exactly is happening in Venezuela? Let's take a brief and simple look. As you may know, Venezuela covers an area of about 916,000 square kilometers, roughly 3 times the size of Vietnam. Yet its population is less than 1/3 of ours, with just over 28 million people. What's more alarming is that the population is shrinking rapidly as citizens flee poverty and seek refuge abroad. So, how poor is Venezuela? In essence, it is not much better off than Cuba. The country's worst economic crises occurred in 2014 and 2018. In 2014, Venezuela's economy began to collapse dramatically, plunging into what seemed like an endless abyss. By 2018, the situation had deteriorated to the point that even Venezuelans themselves, and perhaps the world, could scarcely believe such devastation was possible. To put this into perspective, while countries like Vietnam debate whether inflation at 3% or 5% is manageable, Venezuela saw numbers that defied comprehension. In August 2018 alone, inflation soared by 200%. For the entire year, it skyrocketed by 200,000%. That means prices rose 2,000 times in just 12 months. At the start of the year, a pig costing 1 million VND would be worth 2 billion by the end. A Coca-Cola priced at 10,000 became 20 million. Inflation was so severe that people carried bags of banknotes just to buy a bundle of vegetables. The nation became infamous as a land of millionaires, where millions were needed merely to purchase eggs or bread. At one point, a citizen had to spend a month-and-a-half salary just to buy 36 eggs. A retired teacher queued for 5 hours to collect a pension that, despite sounding like a huge sum, was barely enough for a small can of fish. The government repeatedly adjusted wages to keep pace, sometimes dozens of times a year. Yet each pay rise was instantly consumed by inflation. For instance, a salary might jump from 5 million to 170 million overnight, but in reality, that could hardly buy groceries, if groceries were even available. With money rapidly losing value, people hoarded goods instead of selling them, making shortages even worse. What makes this tragedy striking is that Venezuela was once among the world's wealthiest nations, blessed with vast natural resources. The country possesses the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, around 300 billion barrels, worth an estimated $20 trillion, roughly equal to China's GDP. If divided equally, every Venezuelan would be worth the equivalent of 17 billion VNs, enough to make every family unimaginably wealthy. In fact, back in 2014, Venezuela's GDP reached $400 billion, comparable to Thailand. On a per capita basis, Venezuelans were 2.5 times wealthier than Thais. So why the downfall? The problem lies in the country's overdependence on oil. Oil accounted for 95% of foreign currency earnings, with little investment in other industries. When global oil prices suddenly halved from $100 to $50 in 2014, Venezuela instantly lost half its income. For an individual, a pay cut from 10 million to 5 million may be survivable with outside help. But when an entire nation loses half its income at once, no one can support anyone else. Venezuela entered a downward spiral, and by 2019, its GDP had collapsed to just 50 billion, barely 1/5 of its pre-crisis level. To make matters worse, in 2019, President Trump imposed sweeping sanctions. American companies and financial institutions were banned from dealing with Venezuela, while foreign companies faced penalties if they continued trade. This crippled the country's already devastated economy, justified by allegations of election fraud under President Maduro. The deeper issue, however, stretches back decades. Since the 1970s, Venezuela's leadership pursued extensive nationalization of oil, steel, and agriculture. Yet instead of prosperity, mismanagement and corruption left the economy hollow. With no significant production outside oil, the country had no buffer when oil prices collapsed. Sanctions deprived Venezuela of access to foreign currency, making imports nearly impossible. Everyday goods, from iPhones to Coca-Cola, require dollars, which Venezuela lacked. China became the country's lifeline, exchanging oil for yuan and supplying goods. But this was insufficient, as many essential imports could only come from the US or Europe. The US accused Venezuela of funneling contraband through black markets to earn dollars, prompting Washington to escalate pressure. President Trump even deployed warships near Venezuelan waters, ostensibly to combat drug cartels, but, according to analysts like Phil Gunson, in reality to force Maduro from power. At one point, the US even placed a $50 million bounty on the Venezuelan president. Now, Venezuela faces a critical choice. Will its leadership step down to have sanctions lifted and restore oil exports, potentially regaining prosperity like Brunei or the UAE? Or will they resist to the bitter end, enduring hardship while clashing with US power? Either way, the tragedy remains that a nation with 300 billion barrels of oil, theoretically enough to guarantee generations of wealth, is today mired in poverty. Recently, as military tensions escalated, Russia deployed its Tu-160 White Swan strategic bombers to Venezuela. The first such occurrence took place on September 10, 2008, when two Tu-160s landed in Venezuela to participate in joint military exercises at a time when the South American nation was under mounting pressure from the United States. Russia repeated the move in November 2013. Most notably, on December 10, 2018, two Tu-160s once again touched down in Caracas, coinciding with reports that the administration of President Donald Trump was seriously considering military options against Venezuela. Since the end of the Cold War, the Russian Navy has weakened significantly, compelling Moscow to rely more heavily on strategic bombers as a means of projecting power and safeguarding its interests in distant regions. In this context, the presence of the Tu-160 in Venezuela carried considerable deterrent value. The bomber can carry up to 12 cruise missiles, including the KH-101 and KH-102, the latter capable of being equipped with nuclear warheads. Merely taking off and operating within Venezuelan airspace, the Tu-160 has the capacity to strike targets across the entire American continent, thereby exposing vulnerabilities along the United States' loosely protected southern flank. U.S. pressure on Caracas has never subsided. Washington has previously placed a multi-million-dollar bounty on the arrest of President Nicolás Maduro, deployed at least 3 destroyers, a nuclear-powered attack submarine, and 4,000 Marines near Venezuela, while also stationing F-35A stealth fighters in Puerto Rico. Against such measures, the prospect of Russia redeploying the Tu-160 to Venezuela in order to offset U.S. pressure remains entirely plausible. Beyond being a political symbol, the Tu-160 is regarded as a strategic trump card in Russia's military doctrine. In June, the bomber was used in actual combat for the first time, launching missiles against targets in Ukraine. It is currently the only intercontinental long-range bomber still in production worldwide. The first Tu-160, built in post-Soviet Russia, completed its maiden flight in January 2022. By January 2023, Moscow announced ambitious plans to significantly expand production. Russia's stated goal is to increase its Tu-160 fleet to around 70 aircraft, especially given that many of its older Tu-95MS MSM bombers were destroyed during Ukrainian strikes on June 1st, creating an urgent need for modern replacements. Analysts argue that the presence of Tu-160s in Venezuela would undoubtedly force Washington to deliberate far more cautiously before contemplating direct military intervention, unable to benefit from the very resources that should have secured its future.